He asked for Discord thing last time.
Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I am Alex Howlett, and this week we are talking about private cities. So, privately owned and operated for-profit cities. And some of us read an article by Mark Lutter from 2014 for the on the Foundation for Economic Education website. That's a libertarian think tank, famous libertarian think tank. So he's written an article arguing for private cities. So we're a basic income discussion group. So we're going to talk about private cities, but also what do we think about private cities when we're also thinking about basic income. So let's get started. I'm going to go around the room and get people's initial thoughts. What do you think about the idea of private cities?
I'm not sure yet, actually.
Well, actually, let me just say one more thing. A lot of times in this discussion, we talk about how basic income aligns the interests of private companies, the profit motive, with doing things that are good for people. Because the way to make money is to sell things to people if the people are the ones who have the money. So just throw that thought out there in the context of private cities.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure what I think about them yet. I think there are some, I guess the argument or the idea is that it could be more efficient. It could create for more efficient organization of the cities and better services for people, because you'd have a kind of direct pressure to be attractive to people, which does make a certain kind of sense, but I haven't really thought it through enough to feel kind of confident about it. I guess there's also a lot of unknowns, is this a subset of the cities? Is it all the cities? That kind of thing could make a difference in how the dynamics play out.
Sure. Steve?
The article has a couple of paragraphs about how private cities might help poor people, but I didn't really understand what he was saying. I think a lot of things like basic income need to be added to those paragraphs for it to make sense to me.
Okay, Richard?
Well, there was an example of a private city that, started this year back in March in French Polynesia, but the Thai Navy drove it out as a seastead, and a seastead is a privately owned city that's floats on the water and gets all its resources and things from trading and whatnot, and it can be used to be outside of the scope, the jurisdiction of governments, and maybe they could do embryonic stem cell research when no one else could do it because of ethical reasons and whatnot, things like that. So that's a way that seasteads could be better than the land governments, and the sort of government that a seastead can run could be spread to space and to be space steads, I guess. That's what the article said that I read it.
Huh. Okay. Elizabeth?
I definitely feel sort of dubious about private cities. I like Steve, the sort of oh, this would be good for poor people. I was but are you sure? I'm really dubious about the arguments for oh, but capitalism is great for poor people because there are more of them, and so of course capitalists want to sell things to poor people. And I was okay, I believe you, and yet somehow we still have all of this poverty, and rich people are very, very rich, and we don't seem to have fixed that. It's just being oh, but the market will make this work. Felt sort of underdeveloped, and some of the examples of quasi-private cities are sort of stuff like Dubai. It was oh, we've created this city mostly sort of through just private funding efforts. It was you painted a very shiny picture of this thing. I know less about Hong Kong and other cities that got mentioned, but it was cool. Dubai it's all the largesse of the state on the backs of itinerant workers who are cool, so you're going to work here until we don't need your work anymore, and then we'll fire you, and so then your work visa is over and you will be immediately deported, and you're living in terrible living conditions. It's that Dubai is not the shocking example I would have picked about how the private market is magical.
Non-citizen migrant workers or foreign workers, 90%. Yeah.
And
So That's interesting. And the idea that capitalists want to sell things to poor people. I mean, there are a lot of people who are, like if you're comparing like the ultra rich to everyone else, there's more everyone else, and they're going to sell to the everyone else who has money. That's how they make money. But they're not going to sell products, goods, and services to people who don't have any money. There's no money to be made by doing that, even if there's a lot of them, right?
Yeah.
In my talk last night, I was saying that if you imagined a country in which half of the population had no money and half of the population had money, then the economy would only produce goods and services for the half of the population that had money. Like that's pretty.
Yeah.
There's no reason why they would produce for people who don't have money.
Right. And there's like a greater incentive to produce for a person with more money than a person with less money.
Yeah, if you're just comparing person to person.
Yeah, if you're comparing
Right.
person to person.
But then you can, if there's like lots of people who have less money and only a few people who have more money, then the incentive is
I understand.
to, yeah.
It could override that.
Right. So Mitchell says, when I think of privately run, one thing I think about is an appointed emergency financial manager that is not elected. Okay, so I guess I don't really have a sense of what an emergency financial manager
Well,
is.
like in Flint, Michigan, or other
Oh,
sort of
okay.
failed cities, the governor just puts somebody into it, goes into receivership or conservatorship, and they
I
just have
see.
somebody else run it.
I see. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. If the private city fails, then
What
You know.
happens? Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't have to be bailed out. And Bethany, you brought up an interesting point, which is is it an existing city that you're like taking over with private control, or is it or are you building a new city?
Yeah.
I think even in the private sector, in the free market, businesses fail all the time, right? Is it okay? Like when we make cities private businesses, is it okay for cities to fail, right?
And also, like, I guess it depends on what we mean by fail. Because, like, we might be okay with them going bankrupt, like, if it didn't affect the citizens that much. Like, just running out of money if we had a plan, like a backup
Right.
plan. And, like, the leaders of the city that didn't get their money or something like that.
Right.
But if it failing means, like, all the citizens have, like, horrible quality of life, have to suddenly move out of the blue, like, that's obviously a different version of failing.
Right. You could imagine a world, I mean, if we throw basic income into the mix, you could imagine a world where people aren't necessarily too attached to a particular city. And so maybe it might not be so bad for people to just leave when the city sucks.
I think it depends.
But I think it's also true that if you have a private city and you're starting it in the middle of nowhere and there's no one living there yet, or if it's like a small town or something, and like in order to earn any profit, you have to make that city attractive for people to move to. So you have to figure out, you have to be doing something right, something that's good for people to get them to come. And that's the part that I feel like could really benefit people is, like you if you have people moving there at all, then that you're doing something that's good for the people. You're treating the people right. But as another analogy to the private businesses is that a lot of times when private businesses, they've already got a large customer base, and then they got bought by right. Now, of course, there's lots of examples of publicly run cities that fail.
Yeah.
All the time. So yeah, I mean,
Like Stockton,
Detroit, yeah, these kinds of places.
And there's also like company-run towns where they have company script, where they sell goods. They pay you in company script, and then you have to use it to buy the goods in the town, but you can't spend it elsewhere. So you're kind of stuck there.
Yeah. So my intuition is this: that I think having some amount of profit motive for the people who run cities as an incentive is a good thing. But you would, because like that way they're not just doing kind of what they're kind of supposed to be doing to make it look like they're doing the right thing. They actually have to make calculations that actually kind of maximize their revenue, maximize that kind of stuff. So that could potentially be a good thing. Aligning the incentives correctly. But I don't know if you would want to go the whole way to saying, cities are entirely privately owned. And even if you have a private city, like the laws of the country still need to apply. And there's various things that like if you go to a mall, which he uses as an example of like something that's like a private city, it's a privately run space that provides various public goods for the people who use that space. That still exists within the framework of the kind of greater legal system and stuff like that. But you could imagine that providing, good schools, good infrastructure, would attract more people and, increase, potentially, depending on how you set up your taxes. Like last week we talked about land value tax. So that could be, when you're talking about a private city, that could be just like the fee that you pay for the service of using the city. That's how you could think
and
about
they
it.
mentioned in the article there are 2 Georgist cities that were nationalized in the UK during World War II.
Yeah, so this has some kind of like Georgist underpinnings, kind of taking it to the extreme that, if you have this really efficient tax, then, you could take that a step further and because you're already getting some incentives, right, of using land efficiently with the tax, but then there's an incentive to tax at the level that maximizes the income, and, you get everybody kind of benefiting from the city. Yeah.
I feel like a couple of things that you'd want like it to be pretty easy for people to move, which it's not really true a lot of the time now. At least not large. I guess you can easily move cities. So you'd want like a lot of options near each other. Like it's easier to move cities than to like move a far.
It's easy to move from city to city.
Like people generally want to.
When you said move cities, I thought we were talking about moving whole cities.
I guess what I'm trying to say is we've talked about last time too, like a lot of reasons that people would want to move from where they're living, just like family connections, social connections, all sorts of different things.
Yep.
Investing in a particular house, like building the house the way they want. And some of those aren't such a big deal if you would like be moving to a very different city that's doing better, that's like right next door. Right. Because you'd still be near like the same people mostly. Yeah. But it's worth considering, like with this situation of people's houses and stuff, like if people are kind of sticky, then anything like free marketing like this doesn't work as well. Because as you say, like if it's not doing well, it matters a lot, like how easy it is for people to leave.
Yes.
Which also applies to like publicly run cities that are not doing well. Like it's not necessarily a unique problem to private cities, but if we're doing something riskier, which is I guess kind of an assumption that we're making, I don't know. If we're doing something that we think might be riskier, then I guess we have to consider that downside.
Yeah, I think it is riskier because it has the potential for people to get a crazy idea of how to run a city and then screw it up.
Right.
Obviously, if they build the city in the first place and are able to build it, then they're doing something right, but that doesn't mean they can't screw it up later.
Right, it could get screwed up later, it could get bought, like you said, and then screwed up. And so you'd want like somehow enough mobility to make it easy to have mobility such that wasn't too big of a problem, I think, if you're going to try to do this. I also would feel more comfortable with it being new cities than existing cities, like you were talking about that distinction, because there's already a lot of reasons that people live in existing cities. So in terms of the risk, like you could take over an existing city privately and like screw it up for a long time before everybody like moved out of New York or something. So there's more opportunity for people to suffer. Whereas like a new city, as you said, you have to actually like actively attract people. So I feel like you have to do more right in the beginning to even get it off the ground.
Do you think it's similar to the difference between like normal public schools and like charter schools?
I was thinking about that a little bit. Yeah, like I could imagine a model where like, I guess that, if people wanted to start private cities and they were at first like a minority, the risk is obviously super mitigated, as opposed to something like turning every city into a private city overnight or something. Because you can kind of like see how it works and like, are there unforeseen consequences and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you could imagine a scenario where you have, just ongoing, you'd have some cities are private cities and then the rest are just normal publicly run cities.
Yeah.
And then the private cities are more where the experimentation happens.
Right.
Some of them succeed, some of them fail, and then the publicly run cities can learn from those experiences and apply the stuff that works, just like charter schools and public schools.
Another distinction we talked about is like, would they be for-profit or non-profit?
Right.
Because those are two different kinds of private things, right?
Yeah, and I think in the article he's imagining for-profit private cities, but you could have potentially non-profit private cities as well. that you still have to. It's still a business that you have to run, but it's not the revenue that you earn or the profit that you earn is not about like just going to shareholders and making them wealthy. It's kind of reinvested
Yeah.
into the city.
Because I guess a
Yeah.
concern, especially if you didn't have good competition, like I guess you'd want the profit margin to be small. Because if the profit, like hope ideally at least, because if the profit margin is large, that means you're just like taking a lot of money away from people. Not optimal.
That's
Like with any other good, right?
I don't see that as a problem generally speaking.
Really?
No. No.
Why not?
Well, I mean, what's supposed to happen is goods and services flow in one direction and money flows in the other direction. So if people are spending more money, then they must be getting more benefit, right?
I mean, yeah, but don't we also like there to be like competition that keeps like profit margins fairly low on goods in general?
I mean, most economists want that. I don't see that as necessary, and like in my models, I assume monopoly pricing on everything, and that competition is kind of this secondary effect that brings prices down a little bit, but is not necessary. Like you could imagine efficient markets where it's just entirely monopoly pricing.
But wouldn't that be worse for people?
Why?
Because they have to spend more money for the same things.
They don't necessarily have to spend more money for the same things. It's just that more of the money they spend is going to profit.
As opposed to
More of the money they spend is getting sucked out of the system through profit than kind of like circulating back. That means you can have a higher basic income.
I guess that's what I was
basically.
going to ask. So like I guess
Yeah.
that's a basic. That's like to your question about basic income.
Yeah.
Because without a basic income, I mean, it's not like you can directly give them a higher salary necessarily if the city's like sucking more out of people in taxes. So I feel like my point kind of stands.
Without a basic income, it starts to be a problem when people are accumulating money, because then how do you replace the money? If it's not basic income, then it's something
I guess
else,
that's kind of
right?
what I'm saying.
It's lending and like stuff that like the financial sector expanding, that kind of stuff. So yeah. So what's the main point that you're getting at?
I don't know. I guess I still think that the competition would be good because it would drive better cities to be there.
I think
Isn't that the whole point of this?
I think competition is good in the sense that like if there are cities that are doing a better job providing better,
Right.
quality of life for people, then people will want to move there.
This is where the entire advantage is supposed to come from, right? If there's just one city and it's private versus, I mean, there's no incentive for it to be good if you have to live there.
Well, they're still competing with the existing public cities. Right?
Okay, well that's a kind of competition.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wasn't really specifying.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to not look at like the amount of profit as a problem, and more like what is the benefit that's being provided and how much do people have to pay for
So
it.
does
kind
that
of thing.
mean that you would rather have for-profit private cities then? Because the incentives would be better, do you think? Or
I don't know. I think there's room for both. Yeah. I think a lot of this, the benefits that Mark Lutter is talking about in this article aren't as strong if it's not for profit, because the idea is that like, oh well, now I want to get rich. How do I get people to give me their money? I have to do something for them to get them to do that.
right.
Yeah. So it's a different incentive. Like there's more with the nonprofit. You have to have more social incentives, that kind of thing. But it's still there's still more room for maybe experimentation than a publicly run city that's kind of like stuck in its
Right.
ways. Yeah.
I'll let someone else say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to bring up the point, which I think is related to what we were just talking about, is that we're okay with the privately run mall, privately run city. There start to be some questions about, okay, well, do people have, can people get stuck in a bad situation, that kind of thing. What about a privately run country, right? You can go to larger scale. What about the entire planet Earth, all of humanity? All of our government being privately run by one guy who just wants to get as rich as
Well, that
possible,
sounds
right?
terrible because of what I
Right.
just said about the competition thing.
No, that's what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
this is just to kind of draw attention to the fact that you can make these arguments and they make more sense at a smaller scale. The smaller scale you go.
Yeah.
So when we were talking about the level of the city, it's not one end of the spectrum and it's not the other end of the spectrum. It's kind of in between. So we need to keep in mind, like where it lies along that
But
line.
I think that's what I'm talking about, because I'm talking about the features that
That's
you need.
why I said
for
it was
this-
related to what you
yeah,
were just talking about.
for this to make sense. Like
Yeah.
you don't have free mobility, easy free mobility between countries. Even if it was
Right.
legal, there'd be lots of reasons people wouldn't want to move. So it's not going to work as well.
Right.
As one
Is that sort of like the Ferengi in Star Trek? Where they have like private everything
Yeah, right.
until they're influenced by the Federation.
Yeah, I mean, sort of. I don't think they have a well thought out. I think they're just kind of like a caricature of capitalist, free market thinking or something like that. I think something that's interesting about private cities that's not true about private countries is that there's plenty of open space in the world where private cities could be created.
Like new ones, right? But there is
Yeah, it's within a country, right?
And then 100 miles out, it's controlled by the country. So you have to be in the middle of the 100-mile areas, like what with the seasteads, like I was talking about before.
Right. So
Right.
so the idea, I mean, like there are maybe if you get creative, you can create a country in the middle of the ocean or on Antarctica or something like that. But it's not like it is with cities or the moon or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's not like cities where you can just find some
Right.
land and create a city, and it doesn't actually take up that much space, right? It's just a city. So I think that's a key thing that makes it different from thinking about like a privately run country. Yeah.
The thing about Antarctica is you can't have a country there. There's a bunch of treaties about that.
Yeah, sure, but treaties can change that kind of thing.
And then on the moon, you can't have a city there because there's treaties about that as well.
There's other
Yeah.
reasons why you can't have a city on the
We're
moon.
taking
but
away all our possible options here.
Yeah.
These trees.
So
I was gonna say.
I think you can look at a city like Singapore, which is a city state and like a country, and that could maybe like kind of straddle the line. Like maybe you could create a private city that is also a country, but it's like a small scale type thing or something like that. Do you want to say
I
something?
was gonna say this is only sort of related, but I was just talking to people about like when the different groups were moving to the United States. I mean, obviously there were people here, but they kind of treated it like there weren't, and so they sort of created different cultures in different places in the U.S. Like different groups settled different areas and had different cultures and different norms and different institutions, and I guess people could move to some degree between them. Might be an interesting case study that's like a little bit similar to this.
Yeah, and I think if you have a basic income at a high enough level, that creates a lot more mobility for people too.
It's true,
Yeah.
yeah. Although, as I said, there's other factors, but it certainly
Yep.
creates more.
Yeah. So then you get to the question of, in expectation, if you allow private cities, are people going to be better off? Because obviously,
Right.
normal cities don't necessarily do the best job for their citizens either.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think one interesting thing is like, as I think Steve and also Elizabeth pointed out, like without a basic income, this has some serious problems because, like, what about all the people that are at least technically represented in the democracy? They can vote, but they have no money. So you would kind of be switching. Or at least maybe if you have mostly public cities, it doesn't matter. But certainly the private cities have like zero incentive to attract somebody with no money unless they think they can get them money in some way that they then pay back.
Yeah, I think there's this idea for with people like Mark Lutter that if you can create the institutions and the framework for the economy to get going, then it'll kind of generate money, make everyone more prosperous. Like if you do it right, then it becomes like a
Or something.
yeah. I mean, a privately run city is not going to have not going to be elected. I mean, maybe there's a city owner and then that person determines like the structure for elections or something like that, but it doesn't have to be. Yeah, sure. There's also a lot of aspects of cities that are not democratic already. So yeah.
Another interesting thing we debated is like it's kind of interesting to think about how this would unfold. Like would the first private city be trying to attract like all of the like only rich people because they can pay the most, and then would like the next city be taking a different market share or something like that, or would they be always trying to attract like a mix of income levels? I don't know. Maybe that doesn't matter because people get to choose whether.
Yeah, I mean, this is an important question. If you're thinking about, man, I want to start a private city. How do I make the most money? What would you do?
Right. That's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah.
There's an example of that in in Z Nation, where zombies take over or whatever. There's a
Were they rich zombies or poor zombies?
No,
Very
they're all the rich people go into this country called Zona, and they have all these servants, and that's all the. There's like the rich class, and then there's the servant class, and that's all.
They
And
go there to escape the zombies.
Mhm. And there's like a Elysium where an enclave where everyone on Earth is, well, really poor, and the Elysium they have a cure where you're pretty much dead, and then you're instantly healed if you have a barcode or something.
So yeah, I mean, if I'm designing a private city, would it be possible to create a city that has, a bunch of servants serving an elite class? That might be tricky. How do I attract the servants? Unless the servants are being paid by the rich people, and the rich people are also paying to live in the city or something like that.
Right. Wouldn't that be? I mean, you already have that dynamic.
Yeah, but I mean, would something about the fact that it's a private city like increase that dynamic? I don't think so, right?
I think I don't know. I guess it's the fact that you're kind of starting something from scratch creates different possibilities. Like you're starting a city from scratch. So instead of having like organically developed over a long period of time with like many different people living there, it seems more possible that you could attract like a very specific or odd like subgroup of people to like almost like an intentional community / city. Like I don't know where the line would be, but you could have a city that's like geared towards a particular kind of person. It wouldn't have to be rich people, but any kind of person.
Well, I think an intentional community, commune, stuff like that are kind of an example of this thing that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Like these are privately, organized and owned cities. Sometimes they try to make profit by selling products to the outside world, that kind of thing.
This is what the Rajneesh Pram wanted to do in Oregon, is have a city. Like they wanted to incorporate as a city and they were denied it. But they were basically trying to run a very particular kind of community as a city. And I don't see what would stop some cities from taking that tack.
Yeah.
And even the maybe nonprofit ones which have like a certain mission, or like for-profit ones which just want to have a lot of rich people in them, or I don't know if this is good or bad. I'm just saying it's interesting, like the idea of starting a bunch of new cities.
I would question the business model of creating a city only for rich people, of whether that would be
seems like such a good idea.
That would be what you would want to try.
Well, I'm maybe being a little bit silly. I don't know. Like
I mean, you brought up that idea, and then I brought up the question, like, if we're starting a city, what would we do? And I brought up that question because, like, thinking about if I'm designing a city, am I just going to be able to do something? I would say, like, this is a luxury city, only rich people can live here.
It just costs a lot to live there. You don't say only rich people can live there.
Okay, if it costs a lot to live there, why are people going to want to move?
I mean,
there?
think about like hotels. Like they're really expensive hotels that only rich people can stay in.
Sure, but don't most
like
rich people
clubs or whatever?
Most rich people, I mean, like a lot of times they have their estates or whatever that are like separate from regular society. But most of them want to be like near a city or something that and participate in.
I guess this is the question. Like, what would the people themselves want? But I guess I was taking two things. One, the vast amount of wealth that's held by the like rich people.
Yeah.
Which you could then extract if you're trying to start your city. And two.
But you can't extract it unless you can get them to move.
I know, but I was assuming that a lot of people like to live among people of a similar income. So they might actually want to move to a place with only rich people. Just like they like to vacation in a place with only rich people, or like go to hotels with only rich people.
I think most rich people are rich enough that they can have everything they want and be part of like the actual cities where everything is happening, all the stuff is happening, right? Like there's like the people who live in Manhattan in like penthouses or whatever. Like these are rich people who are part of like they wouldn't want to live in penthouses in a city where there's no people walking around down there and there's nothing interesting happening and there's just a few other people living in penthouses like around, right?
To check how good our psychology is, but I mean, there are some that want. But if you're starting a new city, you're not going to be able to compete with New York. Like you're going to be trying to.
You might be able to compete with New York, not for rich people, but for people who aren't as rich.
Well, I'm just saying, I don't mean nobody would move from New York to you, but I'm saying the kind of person who wants to.
Some people might,
live,
just the rich people wouldn't.
Okay, the rich people wouldn't because they can live anywhere. So I'm saying if you're trying to attract people, like you're not going to attract.
You've got to provide something that people aren't getting in their existing city. Yeah, go ahead.
The rich people who really want to live in a vibrant, multicultural, like multi-income city are obviously not going to move to this place. But I just think there's like a decent subset of people that like to live, like think of suburbs, like there are a lot of people that like to live just around similar other people. And then they would want to go to a place with similar other people, and they don't have to see poverty, and they don't have to like, whatever. They get to live with like people they relate to that think of money the same way they do, and they can culturally feel connected to. And
Right.
that's
Like the
similar
people
across
who,
all different groups, I think.
right, like this is what we're talking about when we talk about intentional communities and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
so this would be like that, but for like really wealthy people. They have a whole different set of concerns, trying to think about what to do with their money, to make a difference in the world or whatever. They can all relate to each other.
I mean, all of this stuff is true. I'm just having a hard time imagining a business model for a city that's only about rich people.
There's retirement communities.
Makes sense to me. I don't know. I don't think it's that important because I think somebody would do that and then somebody else would do the next thing for a different group of people.
Right.
So I don't think all the cities would be
Right,
like
some
that.
people are going to come up with dumb ideas and try to do them.
I don't think. Why do you think this is so dumb?
I guess I don't see how it adds up for like a profit-making
I feel
model.
like this is already what a lot of people try to do is like move to other places with other people with the same income.
Yeah, but they're not. You can move to like a neighborhood that's like that, or you can move to like. It's not.
There are like
Alex, as part of your point, like sort
Yeah.
of like what happens in like the rest of the city that makes it more than just that like gated community neighborhood of like that you're like, okay,
Right.
you have a bunch of rich people living here, but then like, okay, are we just like bringing in other people to be like, cool, like other people are gonna like run businesses and like do all this stuff, and that's gonna, I'm like,
Yeah.
to make it, yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly
I was
right.
like, I was watching this conversation for like 10, and I was like, okay, I think I understand like what's happening here.
I actually posted an article about that. There was like the Sun City thing. The minimum age was 55 in 1960 or whatever, and then they moved up to 1965. To 65 years old more recently, and they have all these new gadgets and things, and they're trying to attract younger people because there's not as many old people who want to move there anymore.
So okay, I don't know about this, but some aspect of what people might.
And I mean, so I just like people live in suburbs. That's true. But the suburbs are attached to a city as well,
But in
right?
these private cities be near other cities. Like,
So you're imagining like a private suburb or something
yeah,
like that.
private suburbs. This doesn't only include large cities, right? In fact, they probably all start out pretty small.
I guess when I'm imagining private cities as described here, I'm imagining like these are places that have subway systems and schools, and like I'm imagining like you would start with a kernel and you grow into a city, so it wouldn't just be like a suburb of like a privately run suburb of some other city. But you could potentially do that.
I feel like there'd be a mix. Like I feel like some people would run with this by saying like I'm going to create a very niche thing. Like maybe it's not just rich people, but whatever it is. Like I'm going to create a thing for this group, like retirees or like people who really like yoga. It's going to be yoga central over here. And then other places would try to be more diverse. It's harder for me to think about how you would try to build like a whole city, but not organically, or like how you would form that seed. It's kind of easier for me to think about like a niche city.
I mean, my intuition is that your initial customers, your initial citizens, are going to be people who are like really screwed in their current situation.
Yeah, that's a good.
You're like, hey,
yeah.
we can fix some problems for you.
Like Frontier
kind of like a
Cities.
cult. That's how cults get people, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Like Frontier cities, like Deadwood and things.
That's not a real city, right?
Deadwood is a real city in North Dakota or South Dakota.
All right, is that what the show is based on?
All the people watching
Okay.
who are from Deadwood are like, insulted now. They're like, what are you?
I thought it was fictional. I didn't know.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's another like group of people that you could try to attract. People who are unhappy, don't have very many options, like aren't happy with their current.
I think that's the main thing that you would do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially if there's,
Good point.
if you have something like a basic income, you're providing a service that's not being provided. Yeah.
Although with the current cities then become a lot better for those people if they had a basic income, like they probably would be a lot.
So that's a
happier.
great question too. It's like we shouldn't be comparing the way cities are now with private cities in a world with basic income, right? That's not a fair
The
comparison.
current cities
Yeah.
would also become much better for people with
Yes.
a basic income, like
That's
for
right.
poor people.
That's right. And then the question is there more opportunity for improvement in a privately run city with a basic income because they are structured in a way to profit off consumers, to get their money from consumers, like that's their main thing. And a normal city might have taxes and stuff like that, but they're not they're not operating in this way that is, like geared towards what basic income pays for. Basic income funds the
I
market,
wish
right?
that I knew more about city government, because I don't have a good intuition for like how poorly it's already working or well it's already working, like how, I don't know. I don't have a good intuition for what kind of level of problem we currently have.
We have a big level of problem. Obviously, it varies from city to city, but I mean, school systems in particular are very, very bad. Yeah. If you start
hold on.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
I'm trying to think though, like with the basic income, like solving these money-related problems from the bottom, like how much of the problem would remain? Like how much of it is it really about how the city's being run? Because as Adrienne quoted, and I think it's probably true. I've seen statistics like this too. Like a lot of the outcomes in education have a lot to do with poverty. He didn't say it exactly like that, but like what's happening at home, like what's happening in the community. So if you were to solve it without solving the poverty, that's sort of been my view of why schools are often bad. But maybe I'm misunderstanding other problems with schools.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think there's problems with the schools themselves too, and it's possible that those problems might start getting better if the students aren't as poor either.
Right.
Like now it's like, oh, we get better outcomes when we actually start running our schools better, right? So we might actually start doing that kind of thing. So I think that's a good point. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, like, again, I guess I just don't have a lot of knowledge. Like, there's that example of Harvard High School where the school had like this huge influx of money, and like the teachers were doing a great job, and everyone was doing, but like there's just like intractable gun violence that like they're dealing with all the time. Like you can't. I don't know how many other problems are that kind
right.
of
And the fact that they had all the resources and all the motivation and still didn't succeed creates an incentive for other schools in similar situations to not even try to succeed because they know it's not going to work if they put in the effort. Yeah, right.
And I guess the other side of problems with schools are like having to do with jobs on the other side, like the fact that we're trying to like funnel people into like a selection process for jobs, and that has a lot to do with like how we run the schools and maybe kind of dumb down the education in a certain way, or I don't know. There's a lot of problems that I don't know if they would be solved by private cities or not.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah. You guys ready to get to the article?
Yeah. I had one more point.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess one more point I had is like usually you've talked about cities as public cities with a basic income kind of being funded maybe by the government or something like that.
Sure.
And I guess what I'm wondering is like that model allows for kind of like resources being allocated in a different sense where like if a certain city is like a good place to live, but it's not a particularly like profit generating city, like maybe it doesn't have a ton of businesses in it or whatever, you can kind of it still has like some subsidization or it still has money coming in for the citizens. This model, I guess, doesn't quite have that benefit where, because you're only getting the money back. I guess unless you add government money, you're only getting the money that comes from the city itself.
The money is coming from the citizens with basic income, then trickling up to the city.
Right, so it's partly the difference between the government funding the city from the top down and the citizens funding the city from the bottom up.
Right.
And right now, even with the way things work now, we imagine it with the citizens. We imagine that the citizens are funding the city from the bottom up, like through the local taxes and that kind of thing. Obviously, it doesn't always work out that way because sometimes cities need to be bailed out or they do receive support from the government, that kind of thing. But this is what we typically imagine, is we imagine cities being funded by the people. Yeah.
But I guess we could also compare it to other options,
We can compare it to other options.
We can compare the current situation, or we can compare private cities to other options that aren't currently being done too, right? We don't just have to compare it to what's happening now.
To other options that aren't being done?
Yeah, like more of the city funding coming from the government is another option. That
we
can compare against this idea of private cities and see what we think about them.
Yep. Yeah, it's also interesting to think about, when we talked about land value tax and which taxes are efficient and actually help the economy work better. If you have a privately run city, then you're more likely to find those taxes because the taxes that help your economy run better also help you, earn more profit, that kind of thing. Whereas if you're just a publicly run city and you're just trying to balance a budget, that kind of thing, you might expect that there should still be the incentive to maximize your revenue, but there's less, you're less connected to like, okay, we want to profit from this, that kind of thing. Yeah. So you might be less likely to find the most efficient taxes to tax people. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Mitchell had it, or Michael.
So Michael says, would a private city cause some of the same problems as the housing market being used as investments for passive incomes? And I think that's a good question. I'm kind of imagining that you'd see private cities naturally implement the kinds of taxes like land value tax and stuff like that to create more efficient use of the land, because that would be what's profitable for the city. It improves the benefits to the people. So I would imagine you might see less of this problem. And then also, if we add basic income to the mix, that makes a big difference there as well. So yeah. All right, article. So rather than focusing on outcomes, we should focus on how to achieve those outcomes. What conditions are necessary to produce the optimal amount of public goods in a city? Asking what is the ideal level of police, street sweepers, and garbage men is just as absurd as asking what is the ideal amount of shoe production. We simply don't know. Markets constantly adjust between supply and demand, seeking this ideal level. So I think this is a good point, that it's hard to look at a city and just allocate the resources. Markets do adjust to find optimal levels of things, at least optimal with respect to some certain criteria, right? To earning the most profit, that kind of thing. But the question is, you could be running a city, having a publicly run city, and you could also tweak things. You can adjust things based on how well you're achieving your outcomes and stuff like that.
And
So,
copy other good cities. There's other
Yeah.
mechanisms.
Yeah,
But
and in
Yeah.
Sweden, there's a garbage truck that actually collects the garbage itself. It lifts up the garbage cans and doesn't have to have a driver or anything like that. So you could just have a bunch of those going 24/7. You don't actually need any garbage men.
right. So what's the ideal level of garbage man? Maybe the ideal level is 0.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe cities are employing people needlessly, because jobs and that kind of thing. And would that be better with a private city? Maybe. Maybe the private city doesn't care about creating jobs as much if they realize that that's actually not providing overall benefit to their citizens,
And
that kind of thing.
they're private, public, and they want to earn a revenue source, increase their revenue. So they don't want to hire as many people as the publicly run city because
you would think construction would become more efficient. Like the big dig-ish type problems. You would imagine that would be hard to have
Well,
happen.
those are private contractors that are being hired by the city.
Right, but wouldn't you have a strong incentive as a city to not hire really inefficient, really expensive contractors?
Yeah, I think you would. The question is, why don't they have that incentive now? I don't think they wanted to
Yeah, I don't
because
know.
have
of
that
campaign
happen.
contributions.
But maybe there's corruption or something that private cities
Could
would help
be.
to weed out. I'm not sure.
So maybe things are too democratic and can be corrupted.
No, I just mean I don't know if there's if there's people who are in with the mayor or whatever and they get their company.
I mean, it's an interesting problem with contractors because they always try to outbid each other on prices, and then
No, they underbid each other, and then they
That's
underbid
what
the actual cost, and then when they start running over for a few years, and they reach the number that they bid, they said, we don't have enough money for this because of inflation or something, and so they ask for more money, and they keep doing that over and over again.
Yeah, so this is kind of the pattern with private contractors, and you can see the incentives, that are creating these conditions. Like, you want to get the contract, so you're going to, you're going to bid lower than might be reasonable. Yeah.
Why hasn't this problem ever been fixed? I guess this is a separate
Yeah.
discussion. It seems like you could change the contracts in some way that would change the incentives.
Change the contracts in some way that would change the incentives.
Like they pay a huge penalty if they go over cost or something like that.
Like what penalty would you put in there?
Oh, yes, there's in China they actually have.
Financial penalty, like.
How about this?
Yeah.
Contracts are binding. That's the point. So why couldn't you have a max that I will not pay you more than this. You're agreeing to do it for.
Because
no
now
matter.
the project is half done, and the people who know
Yeah,
how
and
to finish
you
it.
can sue them because you had a contract that said they couldn't go over that amount. That's what I'm saying.
I mean, you're assuming that these contractors have a lot of money. The whole point is that they're getting money from you in order to do the work, right?
No, I know, but okay, but I've only
Yeah.
thought about it for like 2 seconds. I feel like it's so bizarre that this problem hasn't been solved yet. Even like reputational ratings, you would think would help solve this problem.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to get another customer easily, probably. Yeah, Richard.
In China, they actually have you need to finish it by this date, or else we fine you. And for every day you go after that date.
That kind of thing, right?
Yeah, but the question is, how do you? I mean, so that can work if you're not finishing it on time, right? You can fine them, but that doesn't work for if you're going over budget.
Okay, but let's say
Because the whole point is that you need more money, so you have to give them more money. You can't like fine them at the same time you're giving them more money to finish the project. Yeah.
Let's say that I owe you money,
Okay, let's say that.
and then later I'm like, well, I don't actually have the money to pay you back.
Yes.
Like there are some consequences for that.
Yeah.
So maybe they get paid right now to finish it, or maybe you just bring in some other contractors, but maybe they still owe you in the future. Like maybe they have a legal obligation to pay you back, like there was some contract that they violated. I don't see why this would be like impossible.
I mean, they just go bankrupt and not pay you. I mean,
So then going bankrupt is an incentive not to underquote too much.
Yeah, but I mean, if your business is going to fail anyway, if you don't get the contract, then at least you can try to like roll the dice and hope that maybe you can get in on budget or something like that. I mean, I don't think you're going to get strong enough incentive there.
Well, I don't have to talk about this.
Because they're bidding for their survival as a business, right? So they have to win the bid.
There aren't any like long-term contracting companies that don't have to win every particular bid.
I mean, they don't have to win every one, but there's this problem where if you're not underbidding at all, you're not going to win any contracts, right?
I mean, you could have a book deal. I don't want to talk about this or something. It's not really related to private city. But if you have a book deal and you're supposed to deliver a book by a particular time, you can likewise say like, oh, I didn't finish it, too bad. But it's not like you can just say too bad with no consequences. Sometimes they make you return some of the advance, even though you theoretically have already spent it, like same kind of situation.
Yeah.
There's other situations where you don't just get
it's a much small. The book thing is a much smaller scale thing. When you have a large project like the Big Dig, you've hired all these people and paid them salaries.
But the same issue happens with like construction on people's houses and stuff too. Like littler things seem to run into the same issue.
Yes, that is true. I mean, a lot of times when it comes time that you've discovered that the thing has failed, you're in a situation where you still need to get it done, and the fastest, cheapest way to get it done is just to pay that same contractor more money.
Isn't this kind of vulnerability and exploitation exactly what contracts are supposed to be getting around? This could apply to so many situations, what you're talking about.
It does.
Okay, anyway, this is a separate conversation, I'm sorry. I got into the contractor thing. So maybe, I don't know if private cities would solve that or not then.
I don't know that they would,
The first legal case I worked on was a $1.5 million house where they built it from where they had someone from the bank who worked with both sides, oversaw it, and then they made a check mark for each benchmark they made. And so when they start making a benchmark, the people who were paying to build the house stopped them, and then they paid someone else to take over. So you can do something like that.
Yeah. So more oversight and more documentation of how to finish the project, that kind of thing. I mean, it creates a lot more overhead. I mean, there's no easy answer to this question, right? Because you can't just bring in another contract. I mean, you could bring in another contractor to finish the Big Dig, but then I don't know. Then you run into the same. Not only do you run into the same problems over and over again, but you have to bring that contractor up to speed.
It just takes longer because they have to hire.
And it's potentially more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
I just refuse to believe that this is an unsolvable. It doesn't seem so different from other business problems.
With the was it F-42 or whatever, or F-45, where they were it was supposed to be $10 billion to build it, and it's like $50 billion for the same stupid plane.
Alright, but again, we're on
Yeah, so I mean, whether it's a problem that can be solved, I mean, maybe it is, but I think the fact that it hasn't been solved is pretty strong evidence that it's not just an easy thing to do. You can't just solve it with a contract. Yeah.
There's a lot of inertia in some fields.
With private cities, maybe we could do a little bit better because of, like favoritism from, or politicians being paid or that kind of campaign contributions, that kind of thing.
If the big D goes over, that's obviously bad for the elected officials. But maybe it's a little bit more indirect of an incentive than if like you're way over budget as like a private enterprise.
Yeah.
Like I feel like people feel that more directly, or the people making decisions feel that more directly.
Yeah.
And they're not maybe as easily bailed out by the government or depending on the backup system that you have.
Yeah, and a lot of times as a politician, you're trying to do what looks good politically right now for the citizens instead of what might actually work.
Right. So
Right.
you might
Sometimes
start a
those two things
project
aren't
that
the same
actually
thing.
isn't a good project that looks like a good thing, and then
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yep. Okay. Next
sorry about
quote.
all that.
No, it's fine. It's an interesting
Factors.
discussion. Of course, cities are not like shoes. They are far more complex. Disentangling the marginal benefits of public transportation, the police, or garbage disposal is extremely difficult. Further, as cities are spatially oriented, the application of the laws of economics differs from how we usually think of economic goods. Thus, the territorial nature of municipal goods is often used to justify the status quo.
But it kind of seems like the complexity would argue for his private city thing, depending on how much mobility and competition there is.
I think the complexity, I think the complexity does align with it. Let's go to the next quote, which kind of continues this. However, what if there was a way to align incentives for the provision of local public goods that the private sector doesn't provide because of an inability to exclude non-paying customers? What if there exists a system of governance that could provide an alternative to the morass of public interest that stagnates change in cities today? What if these cities could not only provide local public goods, but also institutional change to jumpstart economic growth? I argue that private cities could do just that. So he's saying that, it's more complex, and that makes it even more, the case that if you can get it to respond to these market incentives, you can figure it out.
Get it right,
Yeah.
without having to figure it out consciously or top down or something.
Right.
Like
Like maybe we could look at shoes and say, okay, there's this many people, we need this many shoes, or something like that.
yeah. But
It gets a lot more complicated.
It's interesting to consider though, like this works best if free market works best in a complex system if a lot of businesses can like go out of business, right? Because if no one's quite able to figure it out, then what happens is like by process of selection and elimination, it gets figured out implicitly or across the system. So would it really work with cities if we're not allowing them to like go out of business all the time? Like, you know what I mean? Like if we're too worried about cities failing, can you still get these benefits? I guess I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think it would be less so. The cities would still want to maximize their profits, so they'd want to be attracting customers. So that would still be there. Richard.
Well, there's the example of in Chicago, they sold the rights for 50 years or something like that for the parking meters, and they built the private company. They replaced all the parking meters, and they'll make all the money that they paid the city back in like 5 years. So and then there's the example of private roads or highways. They have I think it was in Indiana. They sold the rights to a highway, and so they charge a toll, and they'll make back what they charged in like a decade or something. And if someone stops in the middle of the breaks down or whatever, they give them gas, and a gallon of gas, and pay them to go away, so they don't have to deal with it. Because it's actually cheaper to do that than to tow them or something.
What if your car breaks down?
Yeah, that's just if they run out of gas.
Yeah.
I don't know.
If your car is broken down, you can use this gas to.
Maybe
Then the person who's towed in parking lots and stuff here in Boston, they actually have to pay that be towed away.
I
So it would
think
be something
usually if
like
you
that.
run out of gas and you call AAA, they're not going to tow your car away. They're going to bring a gas can.
Right, but maybe they have much faster access. It could take a long time for a AAA to come.
The private bridge actually gives them a gallon of gas so they could go.
It's like they're right there with the gas.
Private bridge.
Because
But,
AAA's
like,
far away.
What?
But like regardless, like
I don't know.
of
I
this,
didn't hear what you said.
but so like what do they if your car is broken in a way other than like it needs gas, is it that they like pay for a tow company? Or basically
No, that person, like if a parking lot, they're not supposed to be parked there.
No,
like
I
in
know. I was
Boston,
asking about your like private highway thing.
the person who's broken down would have to pay it just like anywhere else. But
Any
if it's a
other
gallon of
private
gas,
place.
it's the really inconvenient for they would probably like push them to the side of the road or something like that, and then wait for the tow truck to pick them up, I guess. But with the gallon of gas, it's much cheaper and less inconvenient just to give them a gallon of gas and send them on their way than to pay for them to be towed away. That would be far more expensive.
I guess it's not clear to me how that's different than what we already do.
I was just assuming maybe the gas was closer because they have it right there at the bridge or something. So you
Are we
don't
talking
have
about a
to
bridge or are we
wait.
talking about Are people running out of gas on a bridge?
Oh,
Like, what's happening?
highway, whatever.
I thought it was a
Highway,
bridge.
road, whatever it is.
Or maybe they have more frequent gas around. I don't really know.
Yeah, maybe they just have more efficient infrastructure, like
For getting you to gas.
the people who own the private highway are also providing the tow trucks and doing it as efficiently as possible, that kind of
Because
thing.
like if you
Yeah.
are responsible for your own gas, like the externalities of slowing down traffic or whatever, I guess you don't really bear that cost. But the highway does,
Okay.
and so they have an incentive to like get you going. I don't know.
So Michael says that he lives near that toll road in Indiana, and it's bumpy and it sucks.
Okay,
Uh,
that's good to know.
Okay,
That's funny.
all right.
Yeah, and I'm like interested in hearing more of like some people said they were skeptical about the private cities too. So we haven't heard too many downsides yet. So.
You mean some people here?
Yeah, we're on the live stream. I'm
Oh, okay.
interested in both perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think a lot of this stuff is hard to say, and there's a balance. I don't know. Do you have any more thoughts, Elizabeth?
I mean, not necessarily in this moment. I mean, I guess I sort of feel like, oh, like, so we're gonna just sort of like, I mean, so this paragraph talks about like, oh, or, like there are goods that the private sector currently doesn't provide because of an inability to exclude non-paying customers. And so I'm sort of like, okay, so how is that gonna operate in a private city, like, absent basic income? Like, obviously it makes sense. Like, okay, if everyone like has basic income, then they can afford these like goods. And if we're like, okay, cool, so the private sector, we're gonna like privatize like garbage disposal and like public transit and everything. Like, okay, so that's gonna somehow be a really efficient thing that's not sort of super exploitative. Like, is there like competition
I don't know
within
that.
the city, or are there like competing garbage disposal
Yeah, so I don't.
services? That seems maybe not how you want to run a city. Maybe you do.
So I don't know that they would want to have a private garbage disposal service within the city. What I'm imagining is the garbage disposal service is provided by the city to all of the citizens,
Okay.
and citizens are just generally paying for the
Okay.
service of living in the city. That's like what they're paying for
Okay.
through taxes. That kind of
Okay,
thing.
so somehow like the
Yeah.
private city, we're like trusting whoever runs the private city to be excellent at selecting garbage disposal, public transit, like all of like whatever we're considering public goods.
Yeah, I think what we're
Here.
doing is we're trusting that they really, really want to get it right because it maximizes their profit.
Like
Okay.
right
Yeah.
now, we have like the Soprano situation or whatever, where they're threatening the city leaders, and it's the mafia type people threaten the city leaders to hire their garbage disposal, so they
This is
can.
Well, we have it self-construction. I bet it's all
I don't know, I'm just making things
No, yeah, totally.
Yeah, so when he's talking about excluding non-paying customers, I think he's mostly saying if you don't pay taxes, you don't get to live here or something like that.
Well, what I was imagining him saying
Yeah.
there is that like a private company
Yeah.
just that's producing shoes isn't suddenly going to make a park because it doesn't gain any of the profit from the park unless it
Right.
can like literally charge tickets, and then we don't consider it a park or something.
Right.
But like I think his idea is that the city is something where the whole collective benefit and all the public goods affect the profit of somebody.
Yes.
And so then they have an incentive to provide good public goods, even though like you don't choose who in your city goes to the park, you don't charge them for going to the park, but you charge them taxes, and so you have this incentive to make a city that people want to live in that has good parks and good garbage collection. I think that's what he's trying to argue, right? That like aligns the incentives with somebody to create good public goods in a way that other companies don't have that.
Yeah.
Actually, in Japan, there are private parks, but there they like have all these sports equipment and things like that, and it's run by like sportswear companies and things like that.
Yeah, we have private parks, Disney World and Six Flags.
Those are amusement parks, though.
That's true. They're a certain kind of park.
These are like sports parks.
But that's good. But I think this is to Elizabeth's point that like not everything is very efficiently done, like fully privatized within the city. Like it wouldn't necessarily make sense to have like all of your parks be like pay per park, or all of your police somehow be like a private company or whatever. So I think he's trying to kind of deal with the fact that it can be more efficient to treat these things as public goods, but also get the benefits of.
I guess I'm just sort of a little, like, so when you're talking about like, well, okay, so then you're like, I'm like, okay, so how is this different from like I pay taxes to my city and then like they pick like a garbage disposal.
I think it's the same from your perspective.
It's exactly the same. The difference that he's hoping for is that the private city will have more of an incentive to get it right.
Okay.
Yeah. Otherwise, from like a resident's perspective, I think it's exactly the same. Like.
Right.
But it's just that he's hoping it'll work.
Like it might turn out that if you're running a private city, the most profitable thing for you to do is to have free public transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's what they have in. I think it's like Liechtenstein or something like that, where they have free public transportation. But in Ireland, my brother told me that they, when he went there, they actually pay individual like dumps or whatever to haul away your own trash. They don't have one for the entire city or something like that. You have to hire your own.
Yeah. So you can imagine like different cities, as we were talking about, as they start out, kind of like trying different weird systems, and then like I think his dream is that only the good ones succeed. So even if it's kind of a hard problem to solve, it gets solved eventually. I think, like we said, as long as failing is just never attracting anyone, then that's no big deal. But if you've like attracted people and built a city and then it fails, that could harm people as well. So I don't know about that. Yeah. But I guess if there's like 2 or 3 other cities that take over.
Yeah. I mean, just like we're buying the city. We're the government. We're buying the city. We're gonna implement things that we know work, that we see working in other cities, whether they're public or private. And this city used to work. We can bring back some of that stuff. We're being more conservative. We're not trying to maximize profit, that kind of thing.
Yeah. You'd want some kind of safeguards like that, I think, for the people in the city.
Next quote.
Yeah. I guess I'll just say one more thing, which it feels like to me like it matters a lot whether a lot of people own their own homes and have like mortgages the way that people traditionally do now. I mean, maybe it doesn't matter that much, but in terms of the idea of mobility and moving, that's a big thing that makes it hard for people to move, especially if their mortgage is underwater, or they've just invested a lot in the house, or they've decorated it how they want, or whatever. But owning it especially can get people really stuck where they are. So then that would make them more vulnerable if the city doesn't go well. Yeah,
so I feel like like there's a lot of the word. What is the word I'm looking for? I'm looking for the word synergy. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of there's a lot of synergy between the kinds of things private cities need to succeed and the stuff that basic income helps with. Because if you have basic income and it starts to change the housing market to look more like a normal market. Like it's just a market for a place to live. It's not, like an investment. It's not like you're borrowing a ton of money to get a place to live, that kind of thing. People can be a lot more mobile. Yeah, and that would be more compatible with this kind of thing as well. Right. Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
My brother, he, as you heard, he moved to Connecticut for his new job, and he's still owns his house here in Boston, and he's fixing up the top floor where he lived, and he's going to rent it out, and that's going to pay the entirety of the rent just by itself. So you can actually do something like that if you live in a desirable area. And he also bought a condo down in Connecticut. So if he has to move again, he'll just rent out that condo and like money back there.
Yeah,
So you can just do things like that.
as long as the value is high enough, I guess that there are certain cases where it's not as desirable an area or something like that, and it's harder. But
Yeah, because your point is about like if the city fails,
Right,
people
exactly.
are stuck there.
then
Then
their
it's like,
houses go
okay,
down.
cool, nobody
right.
wants to
And they're
live here, so-
underwater on their mortgages.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly,
so it's
right.
like, okay, I can't rent out my house because no one wants to live here, but I
Exactly,
have
yeah.
to move somewhere else, so I have to pay
Mhm.
rent somewhere else and still pay my mortgage.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That would be the problem, right? Exactly.
So I think people aren't going to be underwater on their mortgages if there are no mortgages. So that helps, right?
I mean, we've talked about there still might be benefits to people owning their homes. Like they might still want to own their homes.
I'm
because
saying if the housing market works more like a normal market,
you
you
think
might.
people would just buy their homes outright.
I think there would be a lot fewer mortgages, or mortgages would be. Yeah, I think it would be closer to that. Yeah.
In a private city like in England, most people don't own the land underneath their house; they own the house itself.
Right.
So that's what it'd probably be in a private city. The private city would own the land, and the people would own the house that's on top of the land.
Yeah, and like we talked when we were talking about the land value tax last week, we didn't get to this part of the article, but they talked about how if you set it at a high enough level, then the price that people pay for the land itself can be down to zero, and really, what you're doing is you're saying, when you're selling the land, you're saying, okay, now this next person gets to pay the tax, or on average it's zero or something
That's
like
kind
that.
of interesting, actually, because to Elizabeth's point and my earlier point, like, wouldn't that mean that like the tax that you'd have to pay would go down if the property around you was losing value?
Well,
so would it be harder to be kind of underwater?
so the property around, so the tax would be based on not just the land around you, but on the improvements, right? So the tax is
Yeah.
based on something different than.
Right, but I'm
Yeah.
saying like if the city is failing, then wouldn't the tax go down?
Yeah.
Which I guess would make it. I guess you only have to pay the tax over time too. So anyway, in this system, you would be easier to leave. Is I guess all I'm saying. As the city
Yeah.
is
So
failing.
it's like
Right.
it's like if you're paying rent in your apartment,
Right.
and then the neighborhood and the apartment building gets crappier and crappier and crappier over
Right.
time, your rent would just automatically go down over time.
That's what I mean.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it seems like a land value tax system where you paid less of it up front and more of it over time would be more flexible for moving around or something.
And the same would be true of property taxes in general, right? Like if you're, and this is true today, if you're paying
Yeah.
taxes on your home and your home becomes less valuable, then your taxes go down.
Right. But
Yeah.
I feel like so much of what people are paying now is the mortgage.
Right.
So even if the taxes go down, they can still really be stuck.
Right. So if you ramp up these kinds of taxes, then a higher proportion of what people pay is going to be these taxes, which vary depending on how valuable your place is, your city is. Yeah.
And maybe in like new cities, people wouldn't want to buy anyway because they would be skippable.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on what you mean by buying, right? Because if you imagine that you're paying this tax, you can imagine, and you're buying it in a private city and you're paying this tax, then what you're really doing is you're paying rent to
that's different.
the city is like your landlord
That's
almost.
different.
Yeah,
Then
I
the
would think
mortgage,
that
right?
everything would be like a condo instead of a house,
Mhm.
where you just buy the apartment instead of buying the house on top of the land or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, you could have it that way. I'm just saying that if you're imagining, you can imagine taxes as kind of like a form of rent. So everyone's really a renter, and then when you're buying something, what you're really doing is you're paying the previous renter to let you rent that out. Let you rent that out the next time. So you can even imagine a situation like that with apartments where there's a certain amount of rent. Maybe it's under rent control or something, well, I guess if someone new moves in, then the rent control gets reset again or something like that. But you can imagine a situation where someone's renting in a particular place, someone else really wants to move there and pay that rent, and they have to pay the existing person, some money to be able to get that privilege of renting out that apartment. So that's basically what you're doing when you're buying a home, and then the tax is the rent you pay.
Right. I guess I'm thinking of
Just
little things
magnitudes.
that matter to people. Like,
Yeah.
are you able to make additions to the house, or like paint the house, or there's a lot of things that make renting inconvenient despite its many conveniences.
Yeah, and I mean, and when we say renting versus owning, like I think it's kind of a continuum, especially when you're thinking of taxes as rent in this way. Like,
Yeah.
what are people, and some people live in communities where the homeowners association say you can only, there's a zoning, right? Like there's
Yeah, like,
there's
you
there's
know,
always
allowed to do
restrictions.
certain
There's
things.
always restrictions, and so it's
Yeah.
a matter of degree a lot of times. Yeah.
But I think a lot of what drives people to buy, which is why I'm bringing this up, is the ability to make some changes, at least inside the house.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know that that's like I guess what I'm saying is I don't know that that's a clear cut distinction between renting and buying, right?
I'm saying I think there's a clear enough distinction, even though there's limitations on owning.
I think in today's society and in Boston area, there is a clear distinction. But if we're imagining a world where taxes are really high and taxes get closer to what we think of as rent, and then ownership gets closer to just right to live in that space, that kind of thing. Like it's theoretically these two things are not discrete things. Renting and owning are not two discrete things, right?
So it could be,
Yeah.
so it could be like subletting. If you own the building and then you rent it out, it'd be like subletting because you don't actually own the plot of land that you're on or something like that.
Yeah, so you could imagine that, let's say you open up a mall in a private city. You pay the taxes to the city, you're paying rent. So you could be thought of as a renter, and then all the shops and everything that open up in your mall, those are all subletters, right? So it's going to be multiple
But I
layers
think
of the
one
hierarchy.
key thing is that we talked about last time is, do you have an incentive to make improvements? And the whole point of the land value tax is to incentivize people to make improvements. So that's an aspect of ownership. That's something I associate with ownership. The ability and maybe the incentive to make improvements.
Yeah, I mean, if people aren't allowed to make improvements, then you can't do anything to create an incentive for them to make improvements.
Right.
Yeah.
So I feel like that aspect of ownership would still be there for at least the first layer, who pays the tax or the land value tax and owns the thing. Like, they would clearly be allowed to make improvements. That's the whole point of the land value tax.
Wouldn't it be
Yeah, but so I mean, like, let's look at a mall again. So each business is renting space in the
Right.
mall, and the mall wants each business to be making improvements, right? They want there are restrictions on what they can do, but like a lot of times you see stores under construction, like that kind of thing. They want them to be maximizing the profitable use of
Right.
that space because that allows them to pay the rent.
Well, I don't
that
want to
kind of
get
thing.
too deep into this, but
Yeah.
I think leases are a lot longer on stores, so then the stores have like a much bigger incentive to actually like.
I mean, the only point I'm making is that this is all a continuum, right? There's always restrictions. Sometimes they're more, sometimes they're less. Generally speaking, most of the time when you rent, a lot of times when something is being rented out, you do want the renter to be using that space profitably because it's good for you too, and to be
I
making
feel like that
the
never
kinds.
happens.
What do you mean?
Well, yeah, like I've never seen that.
I just gave you the example of the mall.
Except with homes, I've never seen it with homes. Like renters are rarely allowed to like even just like repaint or do something that will improve the property. And they have short leases, so if they do it, they know they might not be able to live there for a long time, so it's not really worth doing.
My point is that it's all a continuum, right?
All right. Well, that's fine. But I'm
Okay.
saying like you would want to set it like if I'm trying to think about how these motives affect people's mobility. So
Okay.
I was trying to put those things together in terms of the private cities.
Yes.
Like, would people be making choices that limit their mobility in order to like set up a home and be able to make changes to it? And I guess to some degree, yes, because you've invested in those changes. But I was just trying to think that through, I guess.
Okay.
Because you were saying people might rent more, for example, or whatever, and then I was thinking, well, maybe they still wouldn't rent. And
I think you were saying people. I wasn't the one who said people might rent more.
Well, I don't know. With the basic income, you say it's more like a normal market, and I'm trying to figure out what that means.
Yeah, it mean it's not that people might rent more. It's that there wouldn't be necessarily mortgages as much.
I guess I always imagined you meaning that people would rent more.
No, it's not that there wouldn't be mortgages because people would be renting more. It's that there wouldn't be mortgages because houses would actually be priced reasonably and people could buy them.
Houses would be cheaper.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Richard?
I was just thinking that it should, in a private city, it wouldn't be called a land value tax because the city owns the land. It would be called like a building value tax or something like that because they're improving the buildings on the land.
You might call it different things. You might still call it a land value tax. And I think it's true that Henry George was kind of all, you don't tax what was built on the land. You never tax what was built on the land. But over time, that's now something that's there that you would want people to be using as productively as efficiently as possible. So there's, like my feeling is that you would want other properties too, or other property taxes too, in addition to the land value tax, right? Because it becomes land. It's something that's there that you want to be used efficiently. So as you increase the property tax on the property that people built, it creates a disincentive for people to make the improvement in the first place, but it creates an incentive for once the improvement is there to use it profitably. So there's kind of a balance there too. Yeah. Does that make sense? You want to get the incentives right, including the incentives to improve things, and then the incentives to use what's there to its greatest benefit. So you have a balance between those two things. Is ready for another quote? Proprietary communities are communities defined through private property. A common example is a mall. It is owned by a proprietor who rents out space for income. However, in order to increase the value of the store space, the proprietor must also provide public goods, security, lighting, and open spaces inside the mall. Proprietary communities typically lease land to residents, with revenue the result of increased land value from the provision of public goods. So this is kind of what we were just talking about. That it's you're still providing public goods, so people aren't walking into the mall and then paying a fee for being able to look at the fountain, or paying a fee for the security that is in there. These are all public goods that are being provided by a privately owned community because it maximizes the overall profit of the proprietary community.
Or it could be like if a bar, you have to have a 2-drink minimum. You have to be, for a fountain, you have to be a 2-coin minimum or something like that.
Yeah, so they're not doing that, which I think makes sense because they would be less profitable if they, if you had to pay a toll to enter the mall or something like that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Now, the proprietor gets to choose who he rents to, and not everybody who can just show up with the rent money is allowed to rent a storefront.
That's true.
Okay, so the proprietor is sort of a dictator.
Yep.
Okay, so this is the libertarian utopia we're going for. First involves a dictator.
Yep.
Okay.
Within that, I guess, for each city.
Well, I'm ready for the next quote.
And business owners are, in fact, dictators.
Yeah, they're dictators for their own business.
And over their employees. And fathers and mothers are dictators over their children.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so the dictator, the proprietor, can exclude people who want to pay the money. To the extent that he's doing that, he could either be doing it because he knows that renting out to a certain type of business is going to, hurt the overall profit of the mall, that kind of thing. He could be doing it because he just doesn't like a certain kind of business and he's willing to take a hit on his profits, that kind of thing.
Or he doesn't like the type of person that wants to create the business.
Yeah, that falls under the categories of what I'm saying.
Like he's a racist or something.
Yes, that definitely falls under what I'm talking about. So, you could imagine, at the level of a city, if someone wants to maximize their profit, they have an incentive. Depending on the racism of society as a whole, they may have an incentive to be more racist or less racist, regardless of what their internal feelings are.
You redlines the entire city or something, or the mall or whatever.
Yeah, right. So
But I think Alex is saying, like, if someone's trying to start a white nationalist city, that could be more or less profitable depending on the broader society, I guess.
There actually is a white nationalist city in North Dakota where they bought out the entire city and they're building.
But then I think.
well,
it's
I
not
hope
so
they all
bad
go there
if
and
they all
never
go
come
to
back
that
out
city.
again.
Sounds so like that.
And then there's also what is it?
Actually,
Some religious city bought all Clearwater, I think it was called, Florida. They bought out the entire thing. Scientologists, that's it.
Scientology bought out Clearwater, Florida?
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
I heard about that last month.
This definitely gets into the cult thing though, because like if you get a lot of like if you have white nationalists, for example, interacting with a range of people, they're less likely to become as radicalized. Whereas if they all move to white nationalistville, then they have an increasing incentive to like show off to the other white nationalists, and no incentive to like be friends with anybody else. So they're likely to become more radical and extreme, which I guess doesn't matter unless they start interacting with the rest of society. But this is another tangent.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about the problem of having dictators dictating things, and the question of how do you prevent how do you prevent these kinds of bad social outcomes in cities? Like, I think sometimes the profit motive can help. Sometimes, if you create a racist city, then people won't want to move to a racist city, then you don't earn any money. So, that's self-correcting in that way.
Right.
But sometimes it's not.
Well,
right?
I guess what I'm trying to explore is first, I'm not sure our current system totally deals with this. But second, is it a problem if people have a lot of options for where to live? If somebody wants to create, that's what I was trying to explore in my head. Like, how much of a problem is it in this extreme case where someone wants to create a white nationalist bill?
White nationalist bill. Yeah, I mean, I think the things you were bringing up are concerns.
Right.
Like the concern for me is less what happens within white nationalist bill. The concern for me is more, say you have all these private cities everywhere.
Right.
What happens if they all do this, or something like that?
In the same direction?
In the same direction.
But that seems so implausible to me. Why would that happen?
Well, we don't need. Maybe that's extreme. But what if it causes the general pattern to kind of push in that direction, right? What if it exacerbates, these kinds of social problems? Because
go ahead. How is this not the same question I was starting with about people forming niche communities? Isn't it kind of the same idea?
No, it's a different idea.
It is? Okay, how is it different?
It's different because it's like you used to imagine, like what used to happen, like you talk about sometimes is white business owners would exclude blacks because it would hurt their business because other people wouldn't want to come to that business, that kind of thing. There'd be social punishment, that kind of thing. So my concern is that we might see something like that scaled up, and it might not be black people. It might be like Muslims thinking about them as terrorists or something like that.
Why would that happen more with private cities? Because that could happen with things anyway. I guess I'm not seeing the connection.
Well, libertarians are against anti-Jim Crow laws in the 60s because they interfere with private businesses. There's
and they're kind of against things like affirmative action and stuff like that. They tend to be.
I guess, you could still have regulations on discrimination. Like you said, there's still regulations on the city, so you could still have regulations on discrimination that, you can't have at least an official policy of, no Muslims in the city or something like that.
Right. Yeah. So then this is a question of to what extent. Obviously, private businesses are regulated. To what extent should private cities be regulated? It shouldn't be that there's no rule of law within the private cities, and you'd probably want them to all use the same. They should still be normal cities, right? It's not like you go into Disney World and suddenly people are allowed to murder each other or something
Right,
like
and
that.
there's housing discrimination
Yeah.
laws already, like, you're already not technically allowed to discriminate against certain people on a whole bunch of different bases.
Right. And
There's
but these are
actually the show called The Purge, or a series of movies, and there's a show on USA called The Purge where you're actually allowed to murder people in the city because it's and the person who survives the longest gets money or something like that.
I mean, I feel like there's this issue of whether people would move to the murder city. Maybe this guy
move
would,
to the murder city.
maybe this guy would argue that would take care of it without regulation.
No, I mean, I think generally speaking, you would expect the private cities, just as private businesses and private, anything is, would still be subject to the laws of the land.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes.
I'm just pointing out that, like, I think the argument that this guy would make, perhaps, is that competition would also deal with some of the same problems because people wouldn't want to live in, like, lawless crazy places.
Maybe he's saying that a little bit. I think he's mostly emphasizing the more efficient use of resources for the provision of public goods.
That's fair.
Yeah.
But you sound like you want to say more. I have another.
We were on a thread, and I was getting to something. I was trying to get to something. I don't remember what it was.
I guess another thing I wanted to bring up about this is that you kind of have the same tension with, for example, religious freedom and versus like inclusion, where do we want these private cities to be an avenue for more like intentional communities or certain niches of people coming together, or do you want to ban that and force them to be more diverse? I don't have a clear answer on
So
that.
the point I was trying to get to before was that I brought up the racism thing, I brought up the murder thing. These are extreme examples. Like you can have laws and stuff that are saying no, you can't do certain things, but people are always going to have preferences, and sometimes those preferences might be unfair. And you can, no matter what you regulate, there's always going to be people's preferences that aren't regulated. There's always going to be some form of discrimination, something like that. So whatever is within the framework of what happens to be legal in the laws of the land, could you imagine something like private cities exacerbating that?
I feel like at least the conditions that we have around the private cities would actually make it better in a certain way, because it seems like we have this vision where people can somewhat freely move around based on a whole bunch of parameters we've been thinking might change with basic income and other things. And it seems like if you can more freely move around, then you can more freely get away from a community that has all these biases against you, which, as you say, are hard to like fully regulate away.
That's more a feature of basic income than of private cities, though, right?
Yeah, but maybe private cities are trying to attract, just as you said, they might try to attract poor people. Maybe they're trying to attract people that are not being treated well for any reason.
So it provides more mobility just by virtue of now there are people trying to sell you more options.
Right, they're trying to sell you these options where like maybe it's a more inclusive community.
Works less for poor people who are so poor they don't have any money, like we were talking about
but
before.
I'm saying with a basic income.
Oh, with a basic income, for sure, yeah.
And maybe some cities, like,
yes.
You're saying it would exacerbate, but maybe cities would be trying to attract people that, like, aren't really getting a good situation now.
I think that's right.
So
Yeah.
I could see it going, I'm not sure it would exacerbate it, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're right, that in general it would improve it.
A criticism of like seasets and things like that, and there are actually like people go on cruises into international waters so they can like do illegal drugs and pedophilia and things like that, because there are no laws in international waters, so you can do anything there. So you could that could be a thing that is on seasteads or private cities in the middle of nowhere.
I'm pretty sure if you murdered someone in international waters, someone would still want to arrest
like
you.
BRB Googling laws.
Yeah, right. There are some laws,
Yeah.
wait, but I watched a funny, like, I don't know if it was the last week tonight, something about cruise ships. And
Yeah.
it was a mix. Like, there definitely are some laws that apply, but I think it was fewer regulations and like people.
Right.
They were arguing there were a lot of murders on cruise ships or something like that. But like
Really?
it's not like it's legal to murder, but it's just
Okay.
it was like more deregulated and some maybe crimes that are only crimes some places you can get away with.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
So Michael says, with UBI, then maybe the kids born in ruthless society will have a higher chance of escaping.
Yeah.
I think that's true. Yeah, especially if there's private cities
Right.
saying, "Hey, come escape here."
Yeah, exactly.
In the Americans, people actually use saved up money so they can hire traffickers or whatever to get them into Western Europe and then move them on to the U.S. and things like that. So that's actually sort of what can happen, behind the Iron Curtain to the West.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think there's if there's people who want something and they have money, someone's gonna find a way to provide it for them.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like the positive aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, it's the positive aspect of giving everyone basic income, and it's the positive aspect of I guess private cities too.
Yeah, but I agree with you that like some of this would be helped within cities with a basic income.
Yes.
Because they'd like develop new parts of the city to attract those people and stuff like that too.
Yeah.
But yeah, private cities could be good for that.
For the question of international waters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
According to like one internet article, at least, if international waters are kind of legal no man's land, like it seems like that'd be great, for criminals. Except apparently, rather than belonging to nowhere, international waters kind of belong everywhere.
Yep.
Under the principle of freedom of the seas. So international law dictates that all ships are required to be registered with a territory somewhere,
Oh, I see.
and they come under the jurisdiction of that territory. If you fly no flags, you're subject to any state's law.
Oh no.
And there's
funny.
certain crimes like slavery, piracy, illegal broadcasting that come under the category of universal jurisdiction. So a ship from any state can intervene
Oh,
and be like, "Hey, I see that you're doing a murder."
right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Do you have a permit for that murder?
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and so and so then it's sort of like depending on like the origin of the person perpetrating the crime can be how it gets prosecuted. Even if you contrive to make yourself not be from anywhere, the passive personality principle means that you're under the jurisdiction of the state of the victim of your crime.
Oh,
so like
interesting.
if you murder a French person, then the French government can be like, okay, we will prosecute you for
But
that.
really, who's the victim? The murderer or the murderee?
Or what if they both managed to be not from anywhere? No, but yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, the closing part, basically, if you murder someone in the high seas, you can be prosecuted by the country your vote is registered in, the country you're from, the country your victim is from, or any country that perceives your murdering to be piratical in nature.
Ah, okay.
So
Okay.
That's a lot of options though.
Yeah.
That's reassuring for cruises,
So,
I guess. I said those things about cruises. I think it was more like their labor regulations would have to do with whatever territory they put themselves in, so they put themselves in particular territories in order to.
Yeah, and I think you do see that cruise ships being registered with countries with
The laxist situation, yeah.
yeah, or the countries that allow gambling or something like that.
Right, sure.
Yeah. Proprietary communities offer a solution to a host of problems commonly assumed to justify government intervention. Private property internalizes externalities. Proprietary communities take advantage of that fact by creating private property over land spaces traditionally thought of as public domain. They work by creating a residual claimant in the provision of public goods. That is, proprietors keep as income the rents collected through leases offered after costs are deducted. So again, this is kind of the mall analogy. So you replace rents with taxes, and it's the private city. Let's see. Economists tend not to worry about the provision of goods and services when such provision has the potential to make people rich. The private sector does a good job of making cars because people who make great cars will enjoy financial rewards. On the other hand, no one can get rich stopping overfishing, for example, which is why it remains a problem. But if you have a privately owned and operated ocean, and people pay taxes to fish in that ocean, then you have an incentive to maintain the fish population. So you've internalized that externality.
Or you can have a police force that guards the ocean and makes sure there's no overfishing, or satellites that fly over the ocean.
These are all the mechanisms by which these are the resources you would put into kind of enforcing that.
But
the incentive comes from the fact that you want people to have.
But you can also just stop it with regulation by government. I think is part of what maybe Richard's saying.
But people get around regulations all the time. You have to actually have an army of police or satellites.
I mean, the question is, what's the incentive to enforce the regulation, that kind of thing. And if it's a privately run ocean, then you lose all your profit if everybody overfishes. Then
Oh,
you're gonna
that's
find a
true,
way
but
to do
it's
it.
just not always practical to do it that way.
No, of course not. This is just kind of the analogy he's making, right? Yeah. Let's see. Did I just read that one? Oh no, it's the same one. Proprietary communities offer people a way to get rich by providing public goods. Public goods affect the value of the land on which they are provided. Sanitation tend to raise land values. Because a proprietor's or developer's income depends on the value of the land he is renting out, he has incentives to provide public goods as part of his total offering. So yeah, I mean, this is generally kind of the stuff we're talking about, and I think governments have an incentive to provide public goods too, but maybe the incentive could be stronger here if there's actually profit to be made. And I think it's stronger. It's probably stronger for public cities if people have basic income too.
You mean private cities?
No, public cities.
It's interesting because technically the incentive in a public city is supposed to be you get voted out. And people without money can
Yeah,
vote.
you're right.
And so, but I kind of agree with you, but I think it's through like these other means.
Yeah. So the effect is going to be greater at something like a private city. Yeah.
Some of it might have to do with whether people who don't have much money actually end up voting and that kind of thing too, which could be affected by basic income.
Yes. The way we do it now, people vote with their votes instead of their dollars.
Right.
Whereas here it would be voting with their dollars.
Yeah.
It's also sort of unfair in public cities, like who the responsible party is, and sort of like voting them out. That often you, like, especially in like mayoral elections, you'll have arguments where like, like the challenger is like, oh, so like the mayor's office, has been like really inefficient or corrupt or like lazy or like doesn't care about these priorities, and the mayor's office is like, okay, so like we invested in like these 3 things that we think are really important for the city because of these reasons, and so no, we haven't done this other thing.
Right.
But like we're working on it, or like we inherited this mess from the previous administration,
Right.
and so like it can
right.
often, so like some people will like vote out, so
Right.
and then it's like I'm like cool, so then the next person also wasn't good
Yeah.
at this, sort of like
Yeah.
a mixture of people straight up lying, but then also the challengers being overconfident
Yeah. I think that's
about
a
their
really good point.
ability, like.
Yeah.
They have an
That's a really good
incentive to
point.
do things that look good, that will let them keep their job or get
Right.
elected, that kind of thing, rather than the things that will actually be best for people.
Yeah.
Necessarily.
And I guess one
Yeah.
challenge for the voters is what you're saying, Elizabeth, which is like it can be very difficult to know like who's responsible or if
Yeah.
it's appropriate to vote the person out or
Yeah.
not. Whereas the profits kind of speak for themselves, I guess.
Right.
Whereas if the voters are having to figure it out, it can be quite
Voters
hard.
don't
Yeah.
necessarily know what's best for them, right? They don't have all the information. They
About like how the government works and
how the
and why
government works, how the
problems are
government
there.
should work,
Yeah.
that kind of thing, and they might have strong opinions that are that politicians are playing to
Right.
that aren't actually maximizing their benefit.
Whereas it's easier to know if you want to move to a place or you want to stay living in a place.
Yep.
You can kind of see whether it's working for you.
They
Right.
vote with their feet.
Vote with your feet.
Feet in
yeah.
their dollars, yep. Yep. Let's do one more. Private cities would not be necessary if public municipalities successfully and effectively provided public goods. Unfortunately, this is rarely the case. Cities often fail to provide even the most basic services to the people they are charged with serving, which can lead to the failure of the cities themselves. So let's end on that quote and get people's final thoughts.
Well, I guess this sort of goes back to something I said earlier, which is that I don't have a good sense for like how well cities are run now. I think because Boston is like probably, or Somerville's probably like a decently run city. Like I wouldn't say it doesn't provide even the most basic services. For example, it has trash and a lot of parks and a lot of things, but
Trash collection.
it has trash and trash collection. Yeah.
It doesn't just have parks full of trash.
No,
Okay.
it has trash and parks. They're the same place.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought this was an interesting discussion, and I guess
Cool.
I came around a little bit to being intrigued by this idea, at least as something that was tried kind of on the margins at first. But I think maybe only with a basic, or at least especially with a basic income.
Yeah.
Because it's not really going to help people, like we said, with that much money or who aren't very mobile. It doesn't work well if people aren't that mobile. There's a lot of limitations.
Yeah. Steve.
I can sort of imagine that when poor people in a city get a basic income and they have some money. Actually, the cities as they are now don't really serve poor people very well. And I can imagine a city having a sort of special economic zone with housing and a local economy that's more appropriate for poor people. And that would be sort of the private city, and its rules and regulations would be different than the rest of the city. Rules and regulations more appropriate to poor people.
Okay.
In the article, they actually mentioned that Shenzhen or something like that was a fishing city in 1980 with 300,000 people, and now it has, what was it, 10 million people, I think it is, and it's because of they have much better regulations and things like that. So if you improve it in a special zone, then you can attract a bunch of people, and that's one of the attractions of private cities, apparently.
Okay. Elizabeth.
I'm still dubious about private cities. Yeah, I think it was like an interesting, because the sort of the thing that we sort of landed on about like, oh, well, people could like vote with their dollars. Like I still feel sort of like, okay, but like so many of those complications still exist, and I'm not sure how effective that's going to be able to be. Like, are you going to be like, okay, I'm gonna like stop paying my taxes and leave the city like because I'm mad about like the sanitation, even though like everything else is great? Like, how do you manage to do that? Like, I'm not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the article definitely doesn't talk about that, and I don't have a good sense of, because they don't have a good sense of how these like dictator private cities like how they're run, and so like, okay, so then how do you
Right.
like
Object to it.
So I think, yeah.
yeah, like how do you give sort of like market feedback when it's like a dictator
Right.
city? Because in a mall, it can be like, well, okay, like, you know, nobody's shopping at like racist sunglasses are us, and so like the mall dictator is like, okay, cool, so we're not going to renew your lease because this is not profitable
Right.
for the mall. But if you're paying like your city rent and you're like, well, the sanitation is disposal is terrible, but the schools are great. How?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing because it makes it so that the whole city is the product. So you have to kind of like take all the public goods that they provide and with all of the benefits and the things that aren't so good and stuff like that. And you have to kind of be like, do I want to be living here? Is there another place I'd rather be living that looks better in total?
Yeah.
So you kind of have to view the city as a whole product. And if there's just one thing that they're doing poorly, that might not be enough to get.
Maybe you can
people
move to another part of the city that actually is doing that better, and then that will spread because more people want to live in that one place, and they'll improve it in the rest of the city or something.
Maybe if you have privately run different parts of the city that are privately run. Yeah, I guess we're imagining the city as being, like
One jurisdiction as a whole or something like that.
Well, yeah, like someone's owning the whole city and running it privately. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is a great discussion. My intuition is that what I would want to do is give everyone a basic income and then say, hey, private cities are something that we want to make it easier for people to set up. And think about it like charter schools. So people could move to those cities if they wanted to. We could learn from the successes and the failures and apply those to our publicly run cities. And I think it would be a good thing to be able to have that as part of our society.
Like laboratories of democracy.
Yeah, in a way. So next week we are talking about. So there's an article from 1986 by Robert Vanderdien and Philippe van Parijs. Van Parijs is one of kind of the earlier proponents of modern basic income as it is described today, and they wrote an article called "A Capitalist Road to Communism." And the argument that they're trying to make is that capitalism is a better way to get to communism than socialism is. So it's an article from 1986. So that's what we're talking about next week. We're going to be back on Wednesday December's a little bit weird because we're Thursday this week, then we're Wednesday next week. Week after that, we're on Tuesday, and then we're on Monday. So we're
So confusing.
shifting
Holidays.
as the month of
We
December
decided
goes.
not to have one
Yeah.
on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. So
We decided
that's
not
where
to
the
do that.
Monday comes
Yeah.
from.
And then it was like, I know that.
All right, guys. Thanks,
Yeah,
everybody.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks guys. Thanks guys on the long.